Good morning, everybody. So I'm back, and today we're going to do A Tiger in the Zoo by Leslie Norris. Leslie Norris was born in 1921. He was a Welsh poet and a short story writer. Yet again, a very simple title, but I'm sure the poet has a lot to convey. A Tiger in the Zoo, the poet definitely wants us to think about the tiger. Does he belong in the zoo as opposed to his natural habitat? He wants us to think about freedom versus captivity. Let's read the first stanza. He stalks in his vivid stripes the few steps of his cage, on pads of velvet quiet, in his quiet rage. So the poet begins with the description of this majestic creature that is a tiger. He talks about his vivid stripes, or stripes which are beautiful, sharp, and clear. He personifies the tiger because he uses the pronoun he, and he clearly does it because he wants us, his readers, to empathize with the situation that the tiger is in. Feel what this tiger is going through when he is fettered and confined and caged. Using careful and appropriate diction, the poet begins by saying that the tiger stalks. He doesn't say he walks, but he says he stalks up and down his cage, bringing out his frustration. Again, the use of sharp imagery by describing his vivid stripes. I'm sure the poet wants to paint the clear picture of this magnificent creature in the cage. In the last two lines, again, the poet uses beautiful imagery and appropriate diction. He describes the tiger's paws to be like pads of velvet, because when the tiger walks, his gait or his walk, his steps are quiet and they are soundless. The use of the word velvet, I think, is very appropriate because it also brings out the royalty of the tiger and exudes his royal nature. The last line of this stanza is very powerful. The poet uses an oxymoron, quiet rage, to describe at this point the mental condition of the tiger. The tiger, of course, is angered, he is frustrated, but he cannot express his anger, and therefore his anger is suppressed within himself. And because the tiger has to suppress all this anger within him, therefore the poet uses this beautiful oxymoron to bring that out, to tell us clearly about how the tiger feels. He says that the tiger has this quiet rage, this rage which cannot be expressed, but it is there within him. Let's look at the poetic devices used in this stanza. The poet begins with a synecdoche, which of course is a figure of speech in which a part is made to represent the whole or vice versa. So here, the vivid stripes, of course, represent the entire tiger. We see the use of enjambment in the first two lines, and of course, this is to convey that the poet is overwhelmed while talking about this beautiful, majestic creature. The poet, of course, definitely personifies the tiger. He uses the pronoun he. He talks about the tiger stalking and he talks about his rage. This again is so that the readers can empathize with the tiger. The clever use of a metaphor, the velvet pads, of course, refer to the paws of the tiger. As I mentioned before, the poet ends the stanza with a powerful oxymoron, which is quiet rage. Now, these two words are contrasting. Another example of an oxymoron would be awfully good or screaming silence. Of course, throughout the first stanza, the poet has made powerful use of imagery. He's described the vivid stripes of the tiger. He's used kinesthetic imagery where he describes the movement of the tiger and how he walks, again to paint a crystal clear picture for his readers. Let's move on to the second stanza. He should be lurking in shadow, sliding through long grass near the water hole where plump deer pass. In the second stanza, the poet will clearly tug at your conscience and make you empathize with the tiger because he paints the picture where the tiger should be, and you will definitely agree with the poet. So the poet says that the tiger should be probably in a jungle or a forest where there is tall grass. He should be hiding somewhere, lurking in the shadows, observing his prey. And by painting this picture of the tiger in his natural habitat, of course, the readers feel guilty that at this point the tiger is in a cage. He cannot enjoy his freedom, he can't enjoy the beautiful breeze of the forest, the earthy smell of the long grass. The poet goes on to say that at this point, the tiger does not belong to the cage. He should not be an exhibition for everybody. Rather, he should be near a water hole. He should be in the forest at the water point, be it a lake or a river, and drinking that refreshing water. Now, by painting this contrasting picture of a tiger being in the forest or a jungle, doing what he's meant to do to hunt up his prey, to roam around freely, hide in the grass, look at the deer, visit the watering hole, be a tiger, he has successfully created that empathy in the minds of his readers that a tiger should not be confined and should not be a display object for people. This clearly reflects the mindset of the poet, where he disagrees with wild animals being put on display in cages and being fettered. Poet has used enjambment from the second line to the last line. Of course, he wants to paint a vivid picture of this beautiful, majestic creature being in his habitat. He's made use of alliteration in the words plump pass, again adding to the auditory imagery. And once again, we see the powerful use of imagery. We've seen the imagery of nature, where he describes the water hole, the tall grass. We've seen the use of kinesthetic imagery, which is the imagery of movement, of how the a tiger would be lurking or sliding in his natural habitat in the forest or wilderness, again creating a contrasting picture to the cage and creating empathy for the tiger in the minds of his readers. Let's move on to the next stanza. He should be snarling around houses at the jungle's edge, baring his white fangs, his claws, terrorizing the village. Once again, the poet has created empathy for the tiger, as he says he should be snarling or growling rather than walking up and down and being quiet in a cage. A tiger should be at the jungle's edge, looking at people, snarling at them, growling at them, terrorizing them, because that's what he is supposed to do. In the zoo, in this cage, as mentioned in the previous stanzas, the tiger is quiet. He's walking up and down, he's stalking up and down this small cage, but rather he should be baring his white fangs, his teeth. He should be, using his claws, which have probably become soft because he's walking in the cage. But I'm sure that his claws are sharp and they are, constantly sharpened by the use in the wild. But here his paws have been described as velvet pads because the cage is soft, and probably the poet is trying to tell human beings that we have constantly encroached upon the jungles, and we are constantly intruding upon their territories and broadening our villages and cities and our borders and reducing and shrinking the wild. And because the wilderness, the jungles, and the forests are shrinking, the tigers are compelled to be at the edge of the jungle. So the poet clearly disagrees with this concrete expansion that we are constantly doing and encroaching upon the jungles and the forests. Also, the poet describes the tiger in his element. He talks about his claws and his white, big fangs, his teeth, in comparison to the fact that he is dull and he is vulnerable and helpless in the cage. Of course, in the first two lines, the poet has used enjambment. Again, he doesn't want to pause, he wants to emphatically point out or convey that the tiger should be free. By making use of the onomatopoeic word snarl, the poet paints a vivid picture of the beautiful sounds that the tiger would make. The poet has made use of assonance, where we see the prominent sound of the vowel I in bearing his white fangs. We also see the prominent sound of the vowel O when he says around houses. Um, this is again to add to the auditory imagery. We also see the repetition of the sound S um, when he says, bearing his white fangs, his claws. This is also called sibilance. The poet, of course, has not made use of conjunctions, which is called a syndeton, again, probably to capture the attention of the reader. Let's move on to the next stanza. But he's locked in a concrete cell, his strength behind bars, stalking the length of his cage, ignoring visitors. Very interesting, the poet begins this stanza with the contrasting conjunction but, again to reiterate the point that the tiger should be free in the wild rather than being confined in a cage. Uh, the tiger, of course, is locked in a cage, and that is why he can't display his physical strength. He can't show people his power because he's vulnerable and helpless and he's been locked. And the word locked is very interesting because he's locked on so many levels. He can't roam the wild, of course, because he's in a cage. He can walk only a few steps, again, being restricted by that cage. He can't express himself. He can't snarl or growl or observe anything interesting because he's in that cage and everything around him is the same. It's boring. It's the same thing, same view to see every day. So that word locked is very powerful and very appropriately used by the poet. With the use of clever diction, the poet uses the word stalk instead of walking up and down to bring out the anguish. The last line of this stanza, again, very powerful. It just states two words, that is, ignoring visitors. The tiger is not, definitely not amused by this fame that everybody is coming to see him, that everybody sees him as this majestic creature, as this royal creature. He just wants to be a tiger in the wild. He just wants to snarl, he wants to growl, he wants to roam the free jungles and the forests and lie in the grass and feel the free breeze and the sunlight. Of course, we know that the poet has personified the tiger. He uses the pronoun he, again, to create empathy for the tiger in the minds of his reader. We see assonance in the prominent sound of the vowel E when poet writes, he's locked in a concrete cell. Again, we see the use of consonants in his strength behind bars, the repetition of the sound S and the alphabet B. The use of assonance and consonants is again to capture your attention and also add to the auditory imagery. And let's look at the last stanza. He hears the last voice at night, the patrolling cars, and stares with his brilliant eyes at the brilliant stars. Now, if the tiger was in the wild, he would hear various wild creatures, but here reminding him that he is in a cage, he can hear the voices of human beings, he can hear patrolling cars, and that probably is again very depressing because it's a reminder that he's not in the wild. The patrolling cars, of course, are metaphorical of people, authority, but they haven't been able to cage his spirit. And his free spirit is reflected in his brilliant eyes that are free and they are free to look at whatever they want to. And the poet, of course, repeats the word brilliant in the last two lines, bringing out that common point between the free spirit of the tiger and the free stars that he is looking at. And I'm sure at this point the tiger is probably envious of these beautiful stars that are, free to shine in the sky. And he probably wants to live vicariously or indirectly. Probably these beautiful stars in the sky also remind him of the beautiful stars in the wilderness before he was captured. And therefore, he longingly and enviously looks at those beautiful, brilliant stars. The poet is constantly painting this contrast picture. So here in this stanza, we see voices, human voices, patrolling cars, and then we see, the tiger's brilliant eyes, which are symbolic of freedom and the wild. And we see the beautiful, brilliant stars, which are free to twinkle in the sky. And through these constant contrasts that the poet has used, he is creating that empathy and tugging at our conscience that we shouldn't, confine these beautiful wild creatures. We should let them be where they are. They are born free and they need to live free. Once again, the poet has used enjambment in the third sentence. Um, again, to create that effect, to convey that overwhelming point that the tiger needs to be free, like just like those stars in the sky. There's use of consonants. He hears assonance with his brilliant, um, adding to the auditory imagery. The poet has repeated the word brilliant, therefore using repetition, again to bring out the common factor between the stars and the spirit of the tiger. Uh, as I mentioned before, the patrolling cars are metaphorical of the authorities. So, personally, I think the poet has successfully conveyed his point by, constantly emphasizing that the creatures like the tiger, the lion, all these wild animals, they belong in the wild rather than being exhibit pieces for us in the zoo and discouraging us from going to these zoos. But it's a beautiful poem with a very, very deep message, and I hope that it can tug at the conscience of people who run these zoos and people who visit these zoos. So, next time you visit a zoo, um, think again. And I'll see you soon again with the next poem. Until then, work hard and study hard. Bye bye.